Welcome to another episode of the Harder to Breathe podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Dusick. I was the founding drummer of Maroon 5, but I'm now a licensed therapist, author, and mental health advocate. With me, as always, is my co-host, Duck Maylard. How you doing, Duck?
I am well on a Tuesday morning. It's beautiful out.
It's a nice day.
We were told it was going to rain today, but it looks like it's beautiful. So
those weather people,
they don't know anything. How are you?
I'm good, man. Same. You know, I love when the spring weather starts. I must have that seasonal affective disorder or something, because when the sun starts coming out and the birds start chirping and trees are in bloom, my entire mood shifts into a whole other place. That's
the big one. The trees blooming. I have these night blooming jasmine in my yard that, I let the dog out to pee at 10 o'clock, and all of a sudden you get this whiff of an amazing smell, and it's like my favorite part of this season. I mean, it's a little early still. It's March, but yeah. I had a question for you. I was curious this is going to sound like it out of nowhere, but it's leading somewhere. Do you have anything that is I don't want to say your pet peeve, but like, what's a thing that sets you off and makes you angry? Because first of all, I have a very difficult time imagining you angry. You're so even-tempered that I would imagine that you would, your level of anger would be like, I'm very disappointed in you, as opposed to like letting somebody have it. But is there anything that like is a trigger for you that just drives you absolutely insane? Because there is for me, but I'm curious if you have something.
I feel like you've been reading my mind lately.
Really?
Because every time, like the last few intros that we've done, whenever you bring something up, I'm like, this is something that I was literally just thinking about in the last few days.
Simpatico.
Yeah, we're on the same wavelength here. You're right. It takes a lot for me to get angry. I don't get angry very often. However, I had times in my life when I would say I could be irritable. Things just frustrate me, and it's usually not even people. It's just like when things are not going quite right. And we've talked about like my frustration with technology.
Things not working the way they're supposed to. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big one. But I actually just maybe within the last 4 or 5 months started going to a gym again. I had just been working out at home and, playing sports and doing stuff around the house. I have free weights and things here and a elliptical machine. So I had not belonged to a gym in a long time. And in the time that I've been going to a gym again, I realized and remembered that I do get a much better workout, and there's a lot of incentive to go to an actual gym. However, I just often find that a lot of the time when I'm there and by the time that I leave, I'm really grumpy and annoyed because of people that have bad gym etiquette.
Okay.
I'm realizing it's my thing as much as it is anyone else, because a lot of times it's not that big a deal. It's not something that is a terrible offense that somebody's doing, but I get really frustrated and annoyed with it just because I go to the gym and I want to get a lot done in a short period of time. I want to get it all in, and I have like an agenda and I want to do it. And then I see someone dilly-dallying, or just they're on their phone sitting on the machine and like not aware of anyone around them.
Can I work in there? Can I work in there?
But you can't. It's different now than it was 10, 20 years ago, because you used to be able to at least like make some eye contact and kind of like, especially, the same thing when you're driving and you see like a pedestrian walking across the street and they're just on their phone crossing the street. First of all, that's really dangerous. Sure. But also you're like, we used to make eye contact so you could figure out like, can I go here or do I need to wait here?
Yeah.
And a lot of times, and I'm finding this at the gym now, where everyone's in their little pods doing their own thing, and it's hard to get that eye contact to figure out like, oh, can I get in there? How long are you going to be? Just one of that little finger you hold up,
One more set.
And so I just find myself getting more and more agitated and annoyed, and it helps, I suppose, because I get a better pump because I'm more sort of jacked up. Are
you experiencing? Because I used to go to a gym. Believe it or not, this didn't just happen. But I have not been to the gym since the phenomenon of people filming themselves at gyms or influencers. Do you experience that at your gym? Are there a lot of people with tripods and?
There's a few. It's not a ton. I mean, I live out in the valley. I suppose if you live right in the middle of maybe Hollywood or Beverly Hills, there'd be a ton of that. There are a few people whenever I'm there. there's one guy in particular that, he's talking to his phone in the middle of the gym for an hour. Like he's doing his thing and he's just looking at his phone, and I don't know if he's live streaming or he's shooting it and posting it later.
Mom.
Yeah, I don't know, but there's a tripod and I'm just like, wow, I just can't relate to it. I try not to have judgment. It's like this younger person is in a different place in their life and different generation in terms of the priorities and stuff. I would never think to do that. Like that's not something I would want to do. But it's fascinating to me. It's different. But I do find it, as much as I get frustrated by certain people if they're getting in my way, I do find the different types of people at the gym to be amusing.
Oh yeah.
Because there's that one person who like, you're like, are they even working out? What they're doing doesn't look like it.
Yeah. They're doing the pull-up thing with the assist, but they've gotten the max weight. So it's literally like they're just moving their arms.
Yeah. Or like they've got a weight and they're moving it, but not against gravity.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's
biometrics, dude.
This stuff is just, it's fascinating to me to see the people. And then, look, nothing against people that go to the gym to socialize. I mean, you got to get your socialization where you want. I don't do that, but you see those people and they're like, I think they're just here to hang out. They're just standing around and shooting the shit. And I guess, all right, more
people
power
have their
to
gym crush. They work out at the same time every week. And
right.
I just want to go and see them.
Gym culture. Yeah. So there's pet peeves in there for sure. I've been finding myself more agitated of late, but yeah, in relationships with people in my life, it takes a lot for me to get angry. It happens once in a blue moon, and there's been particular people in my life, I won't name names, that could do it more than others, but
it's me. I'm the problem.
I don't remember ever being angry at you. I think that in terms of just relationships and things that come up in that context, it's when people are inconsiderate, when they're really selfish and don't really think about how it affects somebody else.
Yeah.
That can make me angry.
That's pretty close to my trigger. My answer to that question was always just injustice in general, whatever scale that is.
Yeah.
And it was always when I was like on the subway in New York, my years living in New York, and people were being, whether they were being inconsiderate and not giving someone a seat, or whether, especially if it gets to the point of like, you're just giving somebody a hard time or hassling somebody. It infuriated me when people were doing the wrong thing, And so for many years I was sort of a crusader for, no, this is not the way things should be, And I remember it started really young. I used to go to the Jersey Shore with my family, before my parents even split up. We used to try to take these little trips, and it was the 80s. So I would go out like by myself. I was like 8 or 9, and I'd ride my bike around the town, this little town of Ocean Grove, New Jersey, which is right next to Asbury Park. So when you're in Ocean Grove, you're in this beautiful, cute little beach town. When you go to Asbury Park, it's like Bruce Springsteen's like 80s, all the businesses are leaving town. And it was rough. Yeah. So one day I literally rode my bike into Asbury Park, and there were these kids in a park. And how in like a city park, you hold out your hand and pigeons will just fly up into your hand because they want your food. So these kids were like holding their hand up, and the pigeons would fly up and land. They'd catch them, and then they'd kick them.
Oh.
And I was like 8 or 9, and it just awoke something inside me that was like, this is wrong, and I have got to be the one to stop it. And these were 2 kids that were older than me. And I went over and I got up all my courage and I was like, stop that. Stop biting pigeons. And they pulled the like, where somebody crouches behind you and then the other guy pushes you and you fall over.
Yeah.
Like, that's what happened, and they beat the crap out of me. It was the first fight I'd ever been in, pretty much the only fight I've ever been in, and it wasn't a fight. It was just a beatdown. They beat me up, and they walked away laughing, and I rode my bike back to the little hotel where we were staying, and my dad was so angry, and he got in the car, and we drove around Asbury Park trying to find these kids. I don't know what my dad was going to do if he found them, but I remember even then, that sense of being like, it was worth it. I saved the pigeons.
Righteous.
And it's funny that as I went on in my life, the pursuits that I seemed to be into, which was like skateboarding and then later music, there's an underlying ethos of both of those, depending on the type of music, that's a little bit anarchic, especially skateboarding, this punk ethos of like, sure, fuck everything and break things. And I did it a bit as a kid where it was like you just wanted to cause mischief, but it was always at odds with that desire that I had inside of doing the right thing, right, And so I struggled with being, and I wondered if I felt like a bit of a poser because I didn't break things with my skateboard. I didn't want to shoplift, although I did do that a little bit. And same thing with music. Like, I love music, but I didn't want to, I hated, like, I'd see interviews with Johnny Rotten, you know, and he was so rude to the interviewer. And I was like, this guy's just trying to do his job, you know? And it extended it all throughout my life, where even watching like the Jackass movies or things like that, which I thought were funny, but anytime there was a bit, or Borat, anytime there was a bit where someone else was being made to feel uncomfortable, or being in, like, if they go into someone's store and they trash the guy's store, I was like, that guy just came to work today and he was trying to make a living, and you guys, for your funny bit, decided to trash his, no, injustice, you know? And so that's always gotten me. And it's just, you know, to this day, I still find that wells up inside of me when I see someone being wronged, and I want to step in and I want to help do the right thing. But I don't want to get my ass kicked again. Have you ever had a fight? You ever been in a fight?
God, I had so many follow-ups I could have asked you.
Oh,
but,
sorry.
No, I don't want to turn it into a whole therapy session, I suppose. But
No, we got time.
Well, okay, I'll answer your question first,
Okay.
then I'll ask you. No, I went to an elementary school that was a little rough and tumble. It wasn't, it wasn't a terrible school, but it was a public school. A lot of my friends that I went to high school with went to private elementary schools. I went to a public school. There's a big mix of different people from different parts of the city, and so there were fights on the blacktop daily, which you wouldn't have found at Brentwood Elementary School. So that wasn't foreign to me. I was not a fighter. I was not somebody who was going to get into scuffles. I did have one instance in which this one kid who was in a gang jokingly. And this kid was like literally a head shorter than me, but had biceps like bigger than my thighs. He literally at 12 years old picked me up over his head and threw me in a trash can. And I knew it was sort of jokingly, lovingly. So, and he was a tough kid. I was not going to start anything with him. But that was one time I was like, okay, that was fun. But then the one thing that happened that was kind of funny was in seventh grade. And this was at Brentwood School, actually. This was at the private school.
The main streets of Brentwood.
Yeah. Well, there was, we had this thing called the snack bar, which, you had a snack bar card, and you only had so many dots, and you could get, your nachos or your cup of noodles or whatever. And I had run out of dots, and I didn't have a snack bar card. And I wanted some cup of noodles real bad. This was like an obsession.
It sounds like prison. The commissary.
Similar. And that comes up later in this episode.
Exactly.
So this one kid that I was kind of half teasing, but he had his cup of noodles and he was eating them. And I actually had a can of Sprite. I don't know how I got that, but I was like, come on, just give me a little bit of your cup of noodles in my hands. I need it. It was like, I was like, just kind of being stupid.
Yeah.
But he was like, no, man, I'm hungry. I want to finish this, whatever. So then I jokingly, I knew my Sprite was empty, right? But I'm like, I'm going to pour this on your head if you don't give me some of your cup of noodles. So I'm like holding it above his head. He's like, you don't fucking pour that on my head. And I was like, I'm going to pour it on your head. I'm going to pour it on your head. You got to give me some cup of noodles. And then I tipped it just far enough, and one teeny little drop came out of the can and landed on his head, and he felt that.
In
and
slow motion.
Yeah, exactly. Without missing a beat, he slugged me in the face, and I was so shocked. I went down like on my ass because I didn't imagine that was going to happen in a million years. But I was just like stunned, and I looked up at him, and he went, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Here, take my cup of noodles. Here, take it." And he gave me like the rest of his cup of noodles. I was like, okay. And I was like, yeah, that'll show him.
Yeah, right.
I'm going to eat his cup of noodles.
Just like I planned.
So that was the closest I came to a fist fight.
Wow. Well, because you have always mentioned that, the early Maroon 5 days, you guys fought like brothers and stuff. And I was always curious what those fights really were. I mean, obviously it didn't get physical, or did it? But it was just, were you the peacemaker, or were you one? Because you've said that you've got annoyed, like when Adam would open 5 sodas and take one sip and things. But is that the extent of what those arguments were from your point of view?
I do remember, I wasn't in the band yet. I do remember one story in which I think Mickey punched Adam because he wouldn't stop playing the drums one time. But that was like when they were like
in there.
Yeah. But I did punch Jesse in the chest once, now that I'm remembering. It was kind of like a something came up from like middle school PE class, because I got bullied a lot in PE class, and there were a lot of kids that, because I was an athlete, and the other athletes saw me for whatever reason as like, they called me a pussy, and that was the word that they used, because I was big and strong, and I was a good pitcher and a good athlete, but for whatever reason they decided that I was soft. And so I got picked on a lot, especially by the guys like a grade ahead of me. And so there was a lot of that where it was just like, you know, you say something and then piss someone off just enough that you punch someone in the chest or in the shoulder. It wasn't like I'm going to slug you, knock you out kind of thing. Just kind of like boys being boys, roughhousing. And there was one time, I have a thing about my neck for some reason. All of my shirts growing up were all stretched out in the neck for some reason. My mom had a theory that I must have been strangled or hanged in a previous life.
Oh gosh.
Because
maybe some umbilical cord in utero.
Oh, maybe that could be it. I had never thought of that. I don't know. He was joking around, but I just can remember it like it was yesterday. Standing in my parents' driveway, we were just like loading gear into the car, out of the car, whatever, for whatever reason, joking around, because we joked around a lot. Sure. Jesse grabbed me by the neck with his hands, and I without thinking about it, just punched him in the chest, and he was stunned. He like took a step back.
Oh my God, I'm sorry. Here, take my cup of noodles. I'm sorry.
Right. Then he didn't even have any cup of noodles. Yeah, so we had to go to the store. He had to buy it for me. It was the whole thing. Wow. No, but I remember he was stunned and shocked because it was a very out of character for me.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, is this the dynamic in our relationship now?
It's changed.
And I was like, don't grab him don't strangle me is the takeaway from that. Don't strangle Ryan, okay? But yeah, no, in general, it was a lot of just arguing about, you know, how much
time
bass
signature changes.
How much bass frequency was on the amp EQ, or you know, or like just stupid things that we would argue over for 2 hours until finally somebody relented.
Okay, so put on your therapist hat. Ask me what did my story bring up for you?
Well, I was just going to ask you first and foremost, where do you think that sense of injustice comes from? That sort of righteousness that you had of needing to fight. What injustice went unanswered in your life?
I think the obvious answer would be my family, situation. My father was abusive to my mother, and I think that there was a part of me that wanted to protect her. You know, there were a few times when that happened where like my mom and my dad was getting physical with my mom, and you know, you're a kid and you're kind of cowering in a corner, but something hits you where you get this burst of "Don't touch my mom," and you get up there and you try to get between them. That happened once or twice, and I remember that feeling. And actually, a very empowering moment for my mother. I remember my sister was there too. Boy, this turned dark quickly. But my sister was there too, and my dad was getting rough with my mom, and my sister said, "I'm going to go out and get a baseball bat." And my dad turned to her and says, "Go get the fucking baseball bat." And my mom she went from victim to like, bam, she slapped my dad across the face. She's like, "Don't you talk to her like that." And everything stopped. Like the moment diffused, and my dad was like, okay. And my sister and I were sort of like, we did it. We saved her, you know? So I think there's probably a big element of that, just of wanting to protect someone who, not that my mom was helpless. My mom is a very capable woman who, as we've said, climbs on roofs at 77 years old and refinishes furniture all day. So she's a badass. But that feeling of wanting to stand up for someone who maybe can't stand up for themselves in that moment.
Yeah, that's a common thing you hear with people who have experienced that in their family of origin. You know, I think that you carry that with you. And, you know, it was interesting in the aftermath of the whole Will Smith thing, you know, where he got up and slapped.
Such a discussion of people's, your instinctive response to protecting someone, even if it goes too far, as Will did. It's coming from a good place.
After that, I watched his interview. I think it was with David Letterman, where he talked about, I don't know if he wrote a book or if he was just talking about it publicly for the first time, about how that his biggest regret was not being able to protect his mother. I don't know if it was from his dad or his stepdad, something like that. And then it put it into some context for me. Here's a woman he feels protective of, or there are a lot of different layers to it, I'm sure. A lot of different things going on in that moment. But that's the kind of thing where trauma comes out and you don't really have control over it. It's just a somatic response. You feel it in your body, this impulse to do something about it. Yeah. Some people cower, some people run away, some people fight. It's fight or flight. That's why it's called that. And in that instant, for whatever reason, it triggered a trauma that to him meant I have to fight. Mm-hmm. And that may have been an adaptive response in one context and not a great choice in another. Yeah. But was it a choice, or was it just, kind of being possessed by your trauma?
And it's funny that I, the story I told about being at the Jersey Shore was before my parents split up, but I'm sure there must have been abuse that I witnessed before they were in the middle of because there was a very gray area where my parents had split up, but my father was still around. And that's when things got really bad because he was still trying to get back into the family. And my mom was like, no, but it's funny that I would still have had that response to protect the pigeons when things were quote unquote still okay in my family. So, whether that was the trigger or whether that's just another example of me wanting to protect, it's always been in me that injustice just gets my goat. So.
Well, it was interesting that at the end of the story, you said it was worth it. You felt like you were righteous in standing up and protecting the pigeon.
I saved the pigeons.
I was curious to hear how that ended for you. If that was traumatic for you, the fact that they beat you up, and how you carry that story with you, where it sits in your psyche.
I mean, I even remember in the time being a little. I was dramatic. Like they knocked me over, they punched me a few times, and then one kid kicked me in the head before they left. And I remember laying on the ground for a long time. And there was a part of me that was like, is someone going to come over to me and ask me if I'm okay? Like, as a stranger, and I'm going to be like, I was protecting the pigeons. Mm-hmm. So there was even a performative aspect of it. Mm-hmm. And I think there was some of that too when I limped back to the hotel and told my dad, and I wanted him to drive around and find those kids and beat them up because I wanted him to be proud of me and protect me. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't sit in my mind as like, oh, that was the turning point. That's my origin story or anything like that. It's just, it stands out because it was one of the only times that I got my ass kicked. Right. I got to give a shout out to my sister, who was an excellent fighter in her time. And until I grew bigger than her, she regularly beat my ass. But I don't count those as fights because, it's your sister. So.
Well, if it was something that sat in a traumatic place for you in your memory, I was gonna say that, the behavior that you are describing in these kids, harming animals, bullying, Lord knows what else, perhaps breaking laws, setting fires to things, whatever, are all indications of later sociopathy and probably ending up in prison. So if it makes you feel any better,
screw those guys.
Wherever those guys are at, hopefully they've turned their lives around. They're not doing those things.
Now they're the pigeons. Someone's kicking them. Yeah.
Right. So anyway.
Thank you for making me feel better about what happened to those guys.
Well, you stood up to the bad guys. So
that's right.
That's what we all hope we were capable of doing, and you did it. So
Bruce Springsteen would have been proud. He would have written a song about me. In the parks of Asbury.
It's a town full of losers.
And the pigeons are getting kicked. Yeah. So.
All right. So how do we segue from that? No, there are themes that are running through this episode. I could feel it. I could feel it. Which leads us to the conversation that we just had with a really, really inspiring guy named Doug Bopst. I'm not going to give away too much of his story in this intro because he was gracious enough to kind of give us, the inspirational version of his story that is straight from the horse's mouth. But I will say, he's a trainer, a coach, a speaker, and he's written a few books, and he has a pretty crazy story in terms of the background that led to the life that he lives now, overcoming some serious adversity and finding a way out of the darkness into the light. Mm-hmm. So I found this conversation to be really inspiring and hopeful and fascinating. There was a lot that came out of it actually that I didn't even anticipate when we were sort of preparing for the interview. Anything you want to say before we jump into it?
Same as always, drop us a line, hardertobreathepodcast@gmail.com. But I want to say that, Ryan and I, we talk all the time about the show and about the things that we want to achieve and the things that the way we want the show to go, and regardless of what's happening in the outside world, in our lives, in our careers, this show has been a nice reminder for me of the power of connection with people and the interactions that we've had even on Instagram and on, and when people say that the show means a lot to them, it means a lot to us. And I just want to say to our listeners and to our viewers that thank you. And we really value you. It means a lot to us to not feel like we've said screaming into the void. But every one of you that are listening, if you gain something from the show, we appreciate you. And you matter to us, and you are the sort of the driving force as we do these shows. We're speaking to each and every one of you individually. That's sort of something you keep in the back of your head. You're talking to somebody. And so I want you to know, if you're listening, if you're watching, you matter, you're important. And we thank you for you have a lot of choices in the podcast world, and we'd like to thank you for flying with us. So from the bottom of my heart, sincerely, it means a lot. So thank you for being a part of the Harder to Breathe podcast, and we hope you'll stay with us.
Well, thank you for saying that, Doug. I certainly can attest to feeling the same way about our audience. And, there's that age-old question, like, does art have purpose without an audience? And we are not entirely making art, but to a certain extent, it's artful.
Excuse me, we just sang Bruce Springsteen's song about kicking pigeons. If that's not art, I don't know what is.
Well, the act of creation is art any way you slice it. And so, I think that especially when you're trying to do something that's helpful or hopeful and inspiring, the audience is the essential ingredient. So we really do appreciate and thank you for listening and for giving us feedback. And if any of you know anything about search engine optimization, give us a shout. All right. All jokes aside, great conversation right here. Let's jump into it. Our interview with Doug Bopst right here on the Harder to Breathe podcast. Doug Bopst, welcome to the Harder to Breathe podcast.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for having me.
Gentlemen.
Yeah.
We have never been called gentlemen before. He knows something we don't.
Must be the case.
This is cool, man. We met probably, like a year and a half, 2 years ago when you invited me to come on your podcast, the Adversity Advantage podcast, right?
Shameless plug.
Get it out of the way early.
Well, it's right there in the title, right? I think that's what we have in common, right? Is what we talk about a lot is the challenges that both of us faced in our own lives and how we kind of turn that around into something that's hopefully motivational, inspirational, hopeful for others. And you wrote a book. You've written a few books. Our listeners, may know, you may have listened to your podcast, may not have. I'm sure you've told your story 1,000 times at this point, but I think it would be helpful if you want to do kind of the 3 to 5 minute version of your inspirational story to kind of get the ball rolling, so we'd know where you came from, how you got to where you're at, and what you're doing.
Thanks, man. Yeah, so I host a podcast called The Adversity Advantage, and the ironic thing is that growing up, I used adversity to my disadvantage, and in fact, it led to me being incarcerated on felony drug charges back in 2008, which inevitably saved my life from the depths of addiction and despair. But to give you some context on how I got there, the adversity that I talk about with me was my parents got divorced when I was 5, and it was at a time where, a lot of kids in my friend group, their parents weren't divorced, so I started to develop this mindset of why am I different? And then on top of that, I loved watching sports, loved playing sports. I loved collecting baseball cards, football cards. I was the guy who stayed up late to watch ESPN and then to get up early to watch, the Fresh Sports Center in the morning. The problem was I wasn't good at sports. I wasn't athletic. So I didn't get the notoriety or attention that some of my friends were getting. So again, I started to develop this reinforced what's wrong with me mentality. Then I was picked on a lot in grade school. And so, I was really ashamed of who I was as a kid. I didn't know kind of how to fit in. And I guess I was just looking for whatever way I could to numb the pain, just like everybody else who struggles with drug addiction. And for me, that started with, and I honestly, looking back, it started probably with some food, where I found comfort in food. And the problem for me was I didn't have the best metabolism and started to gain some body fat at an earlier stage than my friends. So I started to, again, develop, enforce this. What's wrong with me? Why am I gaining body fat? My friends aren't. I'm doing the same things as them. And then when I was 14, I was offered my first hit off a weed pipe. And when I took that first hit, I felt that massive weight come off my shoulders, where all that emotional pain went away. I didn't have to worry about what kids thought of me anymore. I didn't have to worry about making the sports teams. I didn't have to worry about my home life. I didn't have to worry about school. Like, all that pain went away. And that became addicting. See, I don't think people become addicted to drugs. I believe they become addicted to the problems they believe that they're solving for themselves, right? And so that cascaded into a variety of other things. Started to smoke every day, developed the habit, sold a little bit on the side to smoke for free and to make a little bit of profit. And then my mom ended up catching me with some weed on my 16th birthday, kicked me out of her house. So now I'm going to live with my dad full time, which was a huge change for me. Changed schools immediately, changed home environments, and then just continued on the path. Like, I didn't change any of my habits or my behaviors. Ended up barely graduating the second high school I went to, because I hardly went to class, because all my friends and I did was ride around and smoke weed. And then when I graduated high school, I had like a few options. Like, I was going to go to community college, or I was going to sell drugs. And I chose the latter. And then there became a new level of addiction for me, in that I found that when people were blowing my phone up for weed, when I started selling weed after high school, I felt wanted for the first time in my life, even though it was like a fleeting feeling of being wanted. And I felt this sense of power and control when people would call me and I didn't answer, or whatever. It was just a really like weird thing. And then I became addicted to the lifestyle of being like this, this career, I thought, drug dealer that I was going to be for the rest of my life. And as you start to do more drugs and sell more drugs, you start to kind of graduate in the drug game, and you start to meet different people who are doing different drugs. And I started experimenting with cocaine when I was a teenager. I think at this point I was probably 17 or 18 years old. And the problem with that was I was an addict, and I had a horrible addiction problem. And so that cocaine snowballed into an addiction in its own right. And I started to snort like an 8-ball of coke a day. And the problem with that in me was I had a hard time with anxiety and depression and fear and panic. And so my
all
cocaine,
things that cocaine is notable for helping with, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like telling somebody just to eat pizza and donuts every day and they'll lose like body fat. Right. It's like the total like opposite of what I needed. And then I started to develop massive panic attacks after getting heavily addicted to coke, and then on top of that selling drugs and smoking a lot of weed. And so there I was at a crossroads. I mean, I had a panic attack so bad that I ended up in the ER because I thought I was dying. And I hit this point where I was like, all right, Doug, change your life and figure out a way to like move forward, or do what you need to maintain this lifestyle that you've become addicted to. And so, of course, for me, like, I needed to survive, and survival for me was the lifestyle. That's how I felt wanted and needed, and then kept on that path. One of my friends, when I was about, I think I was like 18, 19 years old, offered me a 5 milligram Percocet. And then the 5 milligram Percocet gave me the same feeling the weed did at the beginning. All that new weight of emotional pain that I developed came off my back. Now I wasn't having the anxiety anymore. So I started to self-medicate with painkillers, and we all know how this story ends. 5 milligrams quickly turns into 10, 20, 40, all the way up until I'm snorting like hundreds of milligrams up my nose every single day just to support my habit. Barely getting out of bed without snorting pills. And just my life was in complete disarray. And, one of my, I think the biggest setback in my life ended up becoming the greatest blessing, because on Cinco de Mayo of 2008, I'm 20 years old. I'm riding around with a half a pound of weed, on my way to make a drug deal with a few of my buddies. And Cinco de Mayo, obviously, is one of the biggest drinking nights of the year. And I had a busted headlight that I had been meaning to fix. But as we all know, like when you're in the thick of addiction, unless it relates to you getting high, buying, selling drugs, who you're doing drugs with, whatever, like nothing else matters, right? And so changing the headlight didn't matter to me, even though it should have, given the fact that it's a red flag for a cop to pull you over. So I saw a cop running radar. I flashed my high beams at the police officer, thinking it would hide the fact that I had the busted headlight. But inevitably, it gave him a reason to pull me over. So he flashes his lights. My heart sinks in the pit of my stomach. And I'm like, man, my life is over. Like, I just knew I was going down in flames. And pulls me over. I struggled to get my license and registration out because I was so nervous. I just knew that like it wasn't going to end well. And give him the license registration. He ends up searching my car and finding everything. And then I'm in the back of a cop car in handcuffs because he had found the weed. He found $2,000 in cash. He found all the stuff in my car. And I'm like, man, like I'm getting ready to go to jail for felony drug charges because I just got busted selling weed. And I remember just sitting in the back of that cop car. I was 20 years old. And I was just like, how did I get here? I don't know if anybody's ever been in a situation where you hit that moment and your choices and habits just stack up and they're just flooding through your brain. That's what it was like for me. And it was like, how did I get here? How did the kid who just wanted to be loved? How did the kid who just wanted to be good at sports? How did the kid who just wanted to fit in, like, how did he get here? And it was a result of the way I responded to adversity. And not to say that my childhood wasn't different than other people. Sure, it was. However, I made some choices that compounded over time that eventually led to me, being arrested. And then a few months after that, I ended up going to court because I had been officially booked and charged with the possession with the intent to distribute marijuana, which is a felony. And the judge kind of in my mind at the beginning threw the book at me, but he really ended up doing me a solid favor. He said, Doug, you're 20 years old. This felony conviction is going to haunt you for the rest of your life if I find you guilty. He's like, I'm going to make you a deal. He's like, I'm sentencing you to 5 years in jail, but I'm going to suspend everything but 90 days, meaning do the 90-day sentence. If I messed up again, I could potentially go back and do the full 5 years. He's like, I'll give you 5 years probation, 200 hours community service, all kinds of fines and drug classes. But he's like, if you do everything I say, like you complete your probation, you don't fail a drug test, you do everything, at the end of the time, at the end of your probation, I will go back and take the felony conviction off your record and give you probation before judgment. And this is 2008. So you're like, I'm like thinking through my head. I'm like, all right, the world's going to end in 2012. Like, Nostradamus allegedly had predicted that. I'm like, I had been to, countless funerals for my friends at that time in my life. I was like, I don't even know if I'm going to live to see 25. So what does it matter? But nonetheless, I have no other choice but to, take this deal before it went to trial. And so I take the deal and then I report to jail a few weeks later, which ironically was a week after my 21st birthday. And the craziest thing about this entire story, in my opinion, is, or one of them I should say, is the day I went to jail, I cried because I didn't want to go in for obvious reasons. But the day I left, I cried as well because I didn't want to leave. And the reason is because when I first got into jail, the first thing I had to do was detox cold turkey from Oxycontin. Yeah. Because that was like the last thing I did. I was like, you know what? Like, I'm going out with a bang. I'm going to do as much as I can because I'm going to be in jail and like, what's there to do in there? So detox for a few weeks in there, which was horrible, like having the worst case of the flu for weeks. And then my soon-to-be cellmate, Eric, who looked like a more jacked version of Brad Pitt from Fight Club, was like, you're going to start working out with me. And I was like, dude, have you seen me? Like, I could have been a model for Pillsbury back then. Like, there's no way I'm working out. And he's like, whatever, man. And so he He ended up talking to me like one night after I saw him work out, and he was like doing all kinds of crazy stuff in jail as far as fitness. And he was asking me questions. He was like, "Why are you in here?" And I would like make an excuse. He'd be like, "Why are you addicted to drugs?" I would give him all these excuses. And he looked at me and he said, "Quit being a victim." That's like the the PG friendly version. I said, "What?" Because I was used to him, like I was used to people buying my sob story and being like, "It's okay, Doug. Like your childhood was bad. You can do whatever you want," which I think a lot of people validate and justify the way they act after hardship based on something that happened to them years ago, right? And I did that a lot. And he's like, "You're blaming everybody for your problems but yourself." He's like, "There's plenty of people that grew up in situations like yours that aren't in jail, right, Doug?" And I'm like, "Yep." He's like, "So you have two choices. Be a man, look yourself in the mirror and say, you got yourself here and it's up to you to change, or go be a victim and cry in the corner." He's like, "No one's coming to save you." And that moment really like sparked a fire in me to like give this exercise thing a try. And when I got down to work out, I could barely do a push-up for my knees. In fact, I could barely walk up and down the steps because I was also smoking a bunch of cigarettes. And with his motivation and encouragement, training me in there every single day during my sentence, I was able to do a set of 10 push-ups and run a mile by the time my sentence was over. And I just developed this insane level of confidence from that and belief in myself that I could finally beat addiction. And it taught me how to get comfortable being uncomfortable, how to develop discipline, how to show up even when you don't feel like it. All these like life lessons I learned behind bars. And I cried the day I left because I had this dude just randomly come into my life that cared so much about me and wanted to help me save my own. And he gave me a workout plan that I still have framed so I don't forget where I came from. Nice. And then I got out of jail and stayed on the path he gave me and lost a bunch of weight. And then got certified as a personal trainer like a year or two after that or something, and got motivated to help other people use fitness to change their lives. And then because of, building a successful business and really finding a lot of purpose in helping other people, like things just kind of worked and I saw a lot of success personally, professionally. The felony conviction did come off. I did fulfill everything and have held up my end of the bargain, wrote a couple books like, Ryan, I know you mentioned that along the way. And then like all of that encouraged me to share my story to help inspire other people to do stuff like I'm doing now. And then that also was the catalyst for me launching the show, The Adversity Advantage.
Amazing, man. That's quite a story. It's to hear you tell it. I'm glad that I let you tell it and didn't try to summarize it myself, because I think our listeners are really gonna get a lot from that. And I have a lot of questions. I hope I remember everything, because it was like ding, ding, ding. There's so much we could talk about.
Take notes.
Yeah. No. Well, the first thing that stood out to me, it was so interesting. You hear stories of people that, were criminals and then had their life turn around and then, figured out how to live a life on the straight and narrow and that sort of thing. I don't know that I've ever heard somebody talk about the psychology of a drug dealer. And, you were talking about how it made you feel wanted, that people were reaching out to you, and that it gave you also a sense, well, I think we understand the sense of power that comes from that, of course. But totally. It's interesting that you were able to tap into the vulnerable feelings underneath that, what you were sort of medicating by wanting. We all want to be loved, right? That's kind of a basic assumption, but how being a drug dealer could fill that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think external validation is a slippery slope, right? I think, we all need it and want it. And I think there's a healthy level that we should seek, as long as you're doing things that are legal and healthy, et cetera. But there's also that line to where it's like, if you're using it as your only fuel to feel good about yourself, there's a huge problem with that. And as far as like the drug dealing thing, like I wanted to do everything I could to feel cool and fit in. Mm-hmm. And I did that, throughout grade school and high school. And then, and I had friends. I don't want to sit here and say that I didn't have real friends, because I certainly did. However, I think my motives for a lot of what I did regarding friendships were to fit in and look cool and be liked by people and people pleasing and stuff. And then like when I was somebody that didn't get picked for sports teams, and I felt like my family dynamic was different than other people. And I felt like, I wasn't being liked for who I actually was, and I had to put on this other image. My well of validation felt pretty empty, right? And then I was like, oh, I can not only sell drugs to, initially I sold drugs. I was like, oh, I can make some good money that was better than, $5 an hour, or whatever minimum wage was back in the day. I could make some good money. I could support my addiction, because I was addicted to drugs at that time. And I could also just be the man that people called. And I didn't realize how good that felt until I started doing it. And then I was like, wow, this feels amazing that people are talking about me being the person that has like the drugs and stuff. And then because of that, I just became like obsessed with doing whatever I could to meet as many people as possible and sell them drugs. And I cared so much about my reputation as being like the guy who had stuff, that I ended up getting myself in a lot deeper than I thought, to where now, like, once you're a drug dealer, you're a drug dealer. And that lifestyle is kind of hard to shake, because you're so addicted to the fast money. Yeah. And like the people that are blowing up your phone and wanting you. So it was this like, and because it was happening so much and so often, like the fleeting of it never really wore off, because it wasn't like I was like going and doing it one day. I did it every day. Mm-hmm. So every day there was this influx of validation. And that was hard to kick, because I had never felt that feeling of people just really wanting to be around me at all times before.
And at 20, your brain probably isn't, or your psyche isn't able to kind of take a step back and say, these people aren't calling me because they like me. They're calling me because I have drugs. But that endorphin rush of feeling needed is so relatable, and I think people who do the same thing when they don't say no to people, when people ask for favors, it's just that feeling of wanting to be wanted. People are willing to put aside their own best interests and their own personal safety, because they're chasing that feeling of, this person needs me. So even in the furthest extremes of someone like, Munchausen by proxy, who keeps someone sick because everyone gives them attention because, oh, their poor child is sick. There's such a deep-seated need to just feel wanted, to feel the center of attention, that you will unfortunately kind of sabotage your own life just to chase that feeling.
Yeah, and it's very easy to do, because you're just, you're caught in the thick of it, right? And as a kid, people often will ask, like, what would you have done differently? And it's like, I don't know. Because as a kid, it's like you're just trying to survive as a kid and go to school and be liked and have friends. And so it's just a hard thing to kind of grapple with. And I think, once your brain gets like hooked on instant gratification, like the way that I did, it's really hard to escape, because nothing else, and the other way was incredibly painful, incredibly emotionally tough and heavy, that you do everything you possibly can to not go back there. Yeah. And so then, and especially like if you're also an addict, it's like this snowball of stuff that you have to like unwind if you're going to quit. Like you have to unwind the massive influx of validation you get from selling drugs. Then you have to also unwind the massive influx of dopamine and euphoria you get from doing drugs, right? Yeah. And then all the addictive stuff that comes with that. Yeah, man, it was just a really tough thing to kick. And it was like, people were like, did you think you were doing anything wrong? And there was a part of me that certainly that I would come home at night and I'm like, man, like, I wish my life was different. I know I'm made for more. I shouldn't be doing this. But a big part of it, like your environment creates a false sense of normalcy. I talk about this a lot. And that if, everybody around you is doing the same thing, you equate it to being normal, which is what I did. Like I didn't know any other way. And so when people from the outside would say, you shouldn't be doing that, I'd be like, well, everybody else is. Because that was true. And in my jaded, perception of life.
That's very true. I see that a lot where people are kind of stuck in one sort of subculture. Yeah. And they just sort of presume that this is the way life is. And it's like, you can't get enough distance from it to recognize that this is just my context. It doesn't have to be this way. There are other contexts in which to live. I have a question that may sound kind of like a funny question, but it's actually serious. I have a mental image of drug dealers all having a poster of the movie Scarface on their wall in their apartment or their home. And I always find that, because I know to a certain extent within that culture, people do glamorize depictions like that. I always found that strange, because the end, we've all seen the end of that movie, right? It doesn't go well.
No.
It's a tale of how this inevitably leads to, worse and worse outcomes, and obviously a pretty extreme one in that. But can you relate to that at all in terms of like why people gravitate to those sort of depictions, or glamorize it and actually find it to be something that they aspire to? I understand, there's a lot of money, and
the first half is great.
Yeah.
There's a tiger. I mean, come on.
I think it's just a combination of a lot of things. I think that I think everybody's trying to figure out what they want to be when they grow up. And I think when they hit that crossroads and realize that they're not going to be that thing, they end up trying to find somebody else to be like. And a lot of times, if you look at people who idolize drug dealers, there is some like common themes with stuff that's like kind of healthy, right? I mean, I think in a way, like, drug dealers have money, drug dealers have a lot of people around them, drug dealers have, they feel like they're purposeful and they have like meaning to what they're doing. Again, it's all totally wrong and not what people should chase. But how can you take stuff out of that to look at why people do it? I think people crave community and connection, and I think when people are selling drugs, there's typically a lot of people around them. At least that's how it was for me. People crave success. I mean, I think I think success is something that is super healthy and should be, people should like go after what they want in life. Again, it's like how you do that is totally different. I mean, how you do that was, matters even more though. Right. But, and again, people also crave like love, and when people see that these drug dealers have women around them, for instance, I think these people are like, oh, like I want that. Like I want to be able to have attention from people that I'm interested in, etc. And so I just think that people see these things, and they don't have them themselves, and they're like, okay, so then I must just go sell drugs, and that might be the answer to my happiness. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of the way that I see it, just based on my own experience. And then again, everything is like totally wrong based on how people do that.
So then what would you say to a young person listening to this who is attracted to that? You're right. There's a lot about it that are healthy pursuits, to want to connect with more people. If you feel isolated, if you feel like you're not desirable in whatever way socially, and all of a sudden you have this image of a life where you can be connected with people that want you around all the time, and it makes you rich and successful and attractive to women. Like that's a lot of really attractive qualities of a life to want to pursue. And so how would you dissuade someone? How would you tell someone that it's not going to go the way that you imagined it going?
Well, I mean, I think that's the question you ask. Like, where do you see this ending up? Like, where do you think your life will be if you end up, breaking the law and selling drugs for the next few years? Like, what's going to happen? Mm-hmm. And I think people need to get like really honest with themselves and be like, is this the life that you want to live? Is this the way you want to go to get there? I think what happens is people, when they're in a dark place or they're wanting to fit in, they don't have the self-awareness, or they don't have the confidence to look themselves in the mirror and say, is this the life that I want to live? And with that, people then jump to these quick fixes. I think I've done this before where I go into a talk I'm giving, and there's kids, and I'll say, hey, raise your hand if you want to grow up and be addicted to drugs. And nobody raises their hand, but the fact is people will. Sure. And you could ask you do the same thing for selling drugs, right? So the fact is some people will. And I think the reason that people do is for survival, in whatever way survival works for them. It could be financial survival, it could be emotional survival, it could be mental survival, whatever it is. Or they do it because they need to find a way to find purpose and meaning in life and connection.
Yeah.
And when you don't have those things and you're somebody that struggles with instant gratification, you will do what you can to get that feeling in that moment. Right. And so, I think if somebody is, committed to already selling drugs, like I don't know what I could say to be like, dude, stop, other than the obvious, right? Yeah. But I think if somebody can really take a deep dive and inventory into themselves and ask, what is it? Like I had Gabor Mate on the podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with his work.
Yeah,
and he said something to the effect, and I've shared this before, instead of asking what's wrong with addiction, ask what's right. And I think that gets you to an answer faster, because you think about what's right about selling drugs. It's people want connection. They want community. They want to feel loved. They want to feel like they matter in the world. They want to feel like they're successful. Then how do you get there without doing something illegal, right? Then you can start to create a blueprint. You can do the same thing with addiction. Like, what is right about addiction? For me and a lot of other people, it's the solution to solving emotional pain, right? And so if you begin to understand that, then you're like, oh, this makes sense. How can we begin to do these things in a way that's legal and healthy that will guide these people away? Problem is, kids, it's just different. Kids are way more impressionable. Kids, obviously, their brains aren't fully developed. They're more easily influenced. Especially with social media now, it's easier. Kids have access to things way differently than I do or you guys did when we were growing up. But yeah, I think if you're like, hey, if somebody came to me and they were ready to change, what would I ask them to do? I would ask them to get really honest with themselves and ask them why they're doing certain things and where this adds up with what they really want in their life, and then go from there.
And kids are notoriously short-sighted in that they don't have the foresight to everyone thinks they're, that they're not going to be the ones who get addicted. They're not going to be the ones who end up, I'm just selling a little weed on the side. It's not going to turn into a full-time thing. They think they're invincible. And so I think there's, that's one of the big problems is breaking through. If you ask a young kid who's getting into this world, play this string out and tell me how you see this going. No one says, I'll probably be dead at 20. I'll be in jail. They all think they're going to be the exception, So it's especially hard to kind of crack through that exterior of the innocence and the kind of stupidity of youth. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Because everybody's the mentality is it'll never happen to me. And back in the day, like that was very true. You know what I mean? Like back when we were growing up, people for the most part died from doing too much of a substance. Yeah. Like that was the term overdose. Like they took too much of something, or they were somebody that didn't, like quit for a bit, their tolerance went down and they went and did the same amount that they did before and they overdosed. But now, like the idea of people experimenting with drugs, which happened a lot, when we were growing up, it should be out the door given the fact that fentanyl is laced in everything. I was reading something off the DEA's website, and I don't remember exactly what it said, but it said something to the effect of like 6 out of every 10 prescription pills that are bought off the streets have a lethal dose of fentanyl in them. Yeah. That's scary. Mm-hmm.
And the fact that kids are still willing to play those odds because it won't happen to me. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. So you were craving these things that drugs and drug dealing, at least for a time, fulfilled in terms of a sense of purpose, being wanted or desired, the addictive quality of, it's always more available to you, and it sort of never ends. It almost reminded me of a gambling addict, where the stakes just keep getting higher and you have to keep getting that rush, that thrill. We have heard how that ends, but it sounds like today, to kind of skip ahead a little bit, you've found other ways to fulfill those needs.
Totally.
In terms of just feeling good within yourself, seeking connection and purpose, and getting some amount of a rush or a high, a natural high, from the things that you pursue. So can you tell us about sort of how you found these things that you're doing now and what that looks like now? I mean, is it is it an entirely healthy pursuit? Is there like workaholism involved in it as well? Like, let's get honest about this.
Yeah. So like, when I got out of jail, obviously I pursued fitness pretty hard. And, you know, I think like most young dudes, I wanted to get fit so I could get attention from girls and so that I could be like, you know, jacked and, you know, have the abs and all that stuff. Which I think that can be a healthy reason. The problem is that I, again, was using it as fuel to feel good about myself. And I couldn't grapple with the fact that I had a hard time like not doing anything that wasn't so health obsessive. Like I equated me eating a piece of pizza to what the old Doug would do. I was like, you know what, if I eat fast food or if I go out with my friends, then it's going to mess with my abs. And then on top of that, I still, despite, you know, getting attention from girls and being ripped and becoming successful as a personal trainer, I still wasn't happy. And I felt like I'd lied to myself. Because I was like, man, like if I can just get to this place where I'm ripped, I'm successful in a healthy and legal way, and I'm getting attention from, you know, pretty girls, I'll be happy. And I did. I was still miserable, just more angry because I felt like I had just chased the wrong things. And then I just began to really have some tough love through mentors of mine and friends that pushed me into reevaluating my relationship with fitness. But so now fitness is still a big part of my life, but it's not my entire life. You know, one of the other things that's helped me is community. Like everybody, you know, in recovery, you know, community is so important. But for me, it was tough because I was 21 out of jail and I had to get rid of a lot of people that I hung out with, given the fact that I didn't want to live that lifestyle anymore. Right. And so I lived with my grandparents right after I got out of jail, and I would often stay home by myself with them, like watching, you know, the Food Network or Dancing with the Stars and stuff like that. But it gave me time to sit in discomfort by myself, which is the thing that I feared so much, was that if I was by myself, it meant I was lonely and a loser. And I had to overcome that. And I also had to identify what I wanted in friends, and that quantity wasn't as good as quality. Like I wanted to pursue quality over quantity when it came to friendship. So began to really get clear on what I wanted with that. And then I began to attract, you know, certain friends into my life. And then like the spirituality thing became something that was huge for me as well, because, you know, growing up, I had the idea that if I was good, I went to heaven. If I was bad, I went to hell, like many do. And I was like, all right, like I'm on the fast lane I'm on the express lane down to hell, given my
highway to hell.
Yeah, highway to hell. There we go. Based on my life right now. And so I was like, you know what, there's no point of even pursuing God. And then, you know, even in jail, I was like, you know, God, just get me out of jail, like I thought he was like the tooth fairy or something, you know what I mean? It was like, just grant me a wish. And then when I got out, I said to myself, I'm like, man, if God was real, like why did all this happen to me? Like if he's about love and if he's about this, like why did all this bad stuff happen? And then one of my personal training clients was a pastor at a non-denominational church. And this was, again, at this point where I was emotionally I was struggling because I chased after all the wrong things in a healthy way and felt like I needed to recalibrate somehow. And he was like, you're going to go to church with me on Sunday. I was like, there's no way I'm going to church with you. Like, I'm going to hell for putting you through this intense workout. Like, there's no way. And so he was like, all right, man, like whatever. And he was always so like joyful. I was like, man, what's wrong with this guy? Like, why is he so happy? And then like, you know, a mentor of mine, you know, around the same time was like, Doug, like you should really like find some level of spirituality that fits into your life. And then when I did that, or when he said that to me, I like called my client, Ben, and I just said, hey man, like I think I'm ready to give this Christianity thing a try. And when his reaction, it's like I just told him that he won like an Oscar. You know, it was like, I was like, why is this guy so happy right now? And I went into his office and I prayed that, you know, Jesus was my savior. And I felt that same weight come off my back that I did when I was doing drugs. And started to cry and called my mom and apologized, like for the first time authentically for the way that I behaved. And then I began to also realize in my journey that, I wasn't necessarily proud of a lot of the things I did in my past, but God was, because he's used them as fuel to help build me up and build my character and help other people do the same. And it's really allowed me to find a lot of purpose in my pain. And I don't consider myself like a religious dude. Like I believe in Jesus, I believe in God. But, what's really important to me is the fact that I believe that I was kept alive for a reason and that there was so much purpose in my life and what I'm doing now.
Wow. Yeah, that purpose element is so important. And I could relate to a lot of the things you said in terms of early in recovery. You're sort of pursuing the same things in a slightly healthier version, but you can be obsessive and addictive about the things that you are replacing your addiction with. And I think that's a natural part of recovery. I think everyone goes through that to a certain extent. It's like, if you're lucky, the thing you replace your addiction with is a good program of recovery, right? And people criticize the 12 steps sometimes because they think it seems cultish, or people just become addicted to that and it's their whole life. And it's like, yeah, that's a pretty good trade-off. Right. If you were going to die and your addiction was something that was killing you, to something that's actually helping you find new ways of living that are healthier. But in time, you do find more balance, and you start to find ways to actually fill yourself up and heal from the things that you were compensating for in the first place, and not needing these extreme addictive sort of impulses in order to get the same fix or the same escape from those insecurities or vulnerabilities. And it comes in your own time. You can't really plan for it. And for everyone, it's different. For some people, they find religion as you did, and it becomes a sense of purpose and direction that replaces that feeling of emptiness that we were all trying to fill with our drug of choice. For other people, it's their career, and it sounds like it was that for you as well, or other things like family or other sources of real connection. And that's where, for me, whether you're a quote unquote spiritual or religious person or not, spirituality is just that. It's needing something to fill that void that feels connecting, that feels like there's something outside of myself that I belong to, that gives my life meaning. And so that's interesting how that came at a later date. It didn't happen immediately, even though you were healing already from day one when you started exercising and replacing the drug with the fitness and so on. But in time, more meaning came in and more of a sense of belonging. And now you're kind of sharing that with other people, and service, the element of service, for me, I've found is a big source of that as well, because it's so connecting and it's getting out of my own sort of ego needs. And even if I'm doing it sometimes, service, when you're speaking, when you're going and you're doing something to help another person, it can fill your ego needs. And I think I've done that as well early in recovery. It's like, well, I'm helping this person, and aren't I great? And that's fine too. That's part of the process. We're never going to be perfect human beings that are entirely selfless and entirely spiritually motivated. But if you're walking that path and you're going from the darkness towards the light, then that journey is going to reveal more and more that can be uplifting and purposeful.
Totally. And I think I think a lot of people have to get to that point, right? Because I think it's easy in recovery. I mean, you're trying to find like yourself, and you're trying to re-identify like what makes you happy. And then I think when you see success in recovery like I did, and I'm sure you maybe had this feeling too, both of you, that when you're like, I did this, I finally like overcame addiction, you're like patting yourself on the back and you think it's all about you. And then you forget that, like, there's that poem, or I don't know if it's a piece of art, I forget what it is, but it's like where there's like the footprints in the sand.
Sure.
And it's like the guy who's like, where were you, God, when I was going through it? And he's like, there's only like 2 footprints. He's like, that's because I was carrying you, right? And I think people, at least I forgot about that a lot, where, it was like weird. I was like, people were like, you can't make up the fact that this random dude helped you in jail find fitness, and now you're helping other people do the same. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And so that became a huge eye opener for me. And then it was like just about paying it forward. Like I promised my cellmate when I left jail that I would pay it forward, and I would not forget where I came from. Yeah. And so the being of service aspect has been really instrumental. and making peace with a lot of my pain. Like I find great joy in helping people that have struggled with the same thing that I've struggled with, and help provide wisdom and encouragement where I can.
I have a question for both of you, actually, because Doug, I'm not in recovery, but a question about, when you are in those early stages of recovery, and you are, whether it's you're replacing, like you said, replacing that addiction with fitness, or maybe the 12-step programs. How much of an element of that is, fake it till you make it, and you're just going through the motions because someone else is telling you that's what you're supposed to do, and then suddenly you realize, oh, I've been doing this for 3 months and I didn't even realize now it's second nature. Now I'm actually doing it because I want to. There's an element of faith in there too. Like, you talk about your faith. I'm not a religious person at all, but this belief that I'm just going to keep exercising because I believe that somewhere down the line I'm going to be able to do 10 push-ups, or I'm going to keep doing these steps even though it seems like bullshit to me, because these people are telling me that I'm going to feel better, at the end of it. So can either of you kind of talk about that a little bit in terms of how much, and maybe it's a personal thing for each person. Maybe some people feel a sense of purpose right away, but I have to imagine there's a lot of it of like, well, I'm just going to do this because what are my options, going back to using again or no? So talk about a little bit about that, either one of you.
I mean, I think at the beginning, it's like you kind of have to fake it a little bit until you make it. Mm-hmm. I wasn't like, initially I wasn't like, yeah, I'm going to like do this the rest of my life. Initially it was like surviving for that day.
Yeah.
And then once I saw like progress from these small wins, it just was about stacking these small wins. And then you look back and you're like, oh, I haven't like used drugs in a week for the first time in years. Or I was able to do a few push-ups for the first time in my life, or whatever the example was. And then you're like, all right, like I can kind of do this and keep going. And then it was about, okay, what's worked for me thus far? And then how can I, replicate that on a daily basis? And then eventually you start to become a new version of yourself. And then you start to shed that old version of you. And then it becomes more of like, this is just kind of what you do. I didn't go through the 12 steps. I was in jail and then got out and then just kind of found fitness. But as I look back, and I've gone through the steps like later on, went to some meetings just to like support some friends and stuff, which was kind of a weird thing to go to like a meeting when you've been in recovery for like 7 years. And I've never raised my hand like I'm an addict, just an addict, only because I didn't go to like, I didn't go that route. Like, but looking back, a lot of the steps of AA or NA, like I've kind of done as far as like inventory, letting go of resentments, finding a power greater than myself, like all that stuff. But yeah, I think at the beginning, at least for me, it was definitely a fake it till you make it.
Yeah, I think it depends on the person. Everyone's story is different. Everyone's motivation for getting clean is different. However, I think the thing that's unifying for everyone is when you end up in that position, whether you're in an AA room or you're in rehab or you're in jail, you didn't get there on a winning streak, right?
That's a good point.
So there's motivation in that. I think that there's a time at the start where there's a buy-in that has to happen. And for most people, it's not there immediately. And people will tell you, and that's part of the importance of community. It's like you need those people around you to tell you, look, it doesn't matter whether you want to go to this meeting or not. It doesn't matter whether you feel motivated or not. You just have to go and keep going. And even if you feel like shit while you're there, even if you're like the whole time saying, this doesn't apply to me, whatever, just go. And that's part of, being in an institution, you don't have a choice. So that's for some people the best option, but everyone's different. But sooner or later, I remember people saying, you got to do 30 meetings in 30 days or 90 meetings in 90 days. And I was like, whew, that sounds like a lot. Yeah. And the question was like, well, when do you know that you've gone to enough meetings, or that you're going to enough meetings to fix things or whatever, to get you going? And the answer was always, well, when you start actually wanting to go to those meetings, then you're going to enough meetings. Because at some point between 0 and 90 days, if you're doing what you need to do, whether you want to or not, something's going to click at some point. Something is going to click where you realize, you know what, I actually feel better. the things that I'm doing, I feel more connected to other people.
Yeah.
I feel like that hike I took with my sober friend the other day made me feel better than I ever felt at 10 o'clock in the morning after, doing drugs or drinking and unloading my anxieties or my worries or my anger or my resentment in front of a group of people who totally understood what I'm going through and supported me felt better than sitting with it or escaping it with drugs and alcohol. Somewhere along the line, something will happen that makes you feel like this is offering me something that drugs and alcohol never did. And then it becomes a lot easier. The motivation becomes greater. We also have a saying in not the addiction recovery world, but in mental health, which is, and this is kind of a cognitive behavioral therapy thing, is oftentimes behavior precedes motivation.
Right.
If you're sitting around waiting for the motivation to do something, you're going to wait a long time because you're stuck in a rut. You're in that downward spiral. And sometimes it takes the behavior that's taking you out of that in order to create the motivation to do it. Right. And so, yeah, I do. Some people scoff at that idea of fake it till you make it. But I think that on some level, everyone has to do it, but it's also not entirely faking it. It's getting out of the part of your mind, the part of you that's skeptical, defensive.
It says this isn't going to work.
Yeah. And embracing that part of you that's there underneath the surface that wants this more than anything in the world, that knows this is the best thing. It's just shrouded by all of that addictive thinking that's creating denial and rationalization and defensiveness. Mm-hmm. And so it's how do you get past that just enough to embrace the authentic part of you that wants to live better, that knows that this has led to nothing but pain and misery for me, and I want something better. That's the way I was when I was in rehab. It was like, I was skeptical about the 12 steps. I was skeptical about spirituality and faith and all the things that they talked about in some of these meetings. But what I knew for a fact at that point, I'd gotten beaten down by my addiction so much that it wasn't giving me the answers I was looking for.
Yeah.
So I had to be open to something else. And even if it meant sitting there and listening to people talk and rolling my eyes and looking at the 12 steps on either side of the stage, I have to pretend like this means something to me. And then eventually maybe it will start to mean something to me because it clearly seems to be helping all these other people that have been here longer than me. And so, yeah, you can call it fake it till you make it, or you could just call it my way isn't working and let me just try something else and see if maybe it starts to stick, even though I have all this defensiveness in me that's telling me don't trust this. Yeah. But it did. Eventually, by the time I was, a month or two into recovery, I started to get it. I started to understand how it applied to me and my own version of spirituality. And so then I understood faith. You sometimes, even if your brain is telling you something is not going to work, you have to just find that place of faith and know like, well, I just got to take a leap here and see what's on the other side, because I know what's on the side behind me and it's not so good. So that's how it worked for me.
Oh, I love that concept of you're not here on a winning streak. That should be on the wall at any recovery center. Like the first thing you see, just remind you, you're not here on a winning streak. Speaking of which, Doug, I was wondering, could we talk jail for a second?
Sure.
Just because, you don't get that opportunity to really hear about that experience much. And I think, we all have watched a million prison movies. We all have this image in our head that, well, if I went to jail, I'd really use that time well. I'd get my law degree and I'd work out and I'd get jacked and things like that. I'd write the great American novel. But can you talk a little bit about those honest feelings of what that was like, walking in that first day crying because you were afraid? Was there a sense of community in there that you were surprised by, or was there the fear and all the things that we all are worried about, in terms of going to jail?
Yeah, those fears were definitely there initially because I was somebody that, again, was really out of shape, weak, etc. Plus, I was like, coming out of a horrific drug addiction, so I just didn't have it all together. But then as time went on, other feelings came up. Like it was like, why am I here? Like remorse. Like I can't believe that I did all this stuff that got me here, and you just feel so terrible about yourself and not being able to talk to who you want, not being able to go where you want, not being able to do what you want anymore. You're kind of confined, right, into a box. And then you have this harsh realization that the food isn't, necessarily what you're getting on the outside. And then, there's some other negative things that came with that, as far as like fear of the unknown, or, fear of, am I going to get out on time? Like those sorts of things. But I guess the more time I was in there, I became more adaptive and began to develop some friends in there. I mean, there is a community aspect. Like what I've learned is like, as long as you're like doing your time and you're not bothering people, I mean, people tend not to mess with you because everyone's in there trying to do the same thing. They're trying to get out.
Keep their head down.
Yeah, without extending their sentence. And people surprisingly were very encouraging of me, like especially on my fitness journey. They were like super proud of what I was doing. And they also helped to hold me accountable. Like there was times where I didn't feel like running. There was times where I didn't feel like staying on the diet my cellmate had given me. And they like held me accountable, whether it was cheering me on or telling my cellmate if I wasn't doing things. Like it was an interesting dynamic in there for sure. But yeah, I mean, a lot of fears going into it. But again, like once I had that transformation and that realization of being in there, things definitely, got better as far as how I viewed the situation.
How does one stay on a diet plan in prison? I have to assume there isn't a large variety of choices.
There's not. I mean, it was really like, I was lucky to have commissary, so I could buy like tuna and stuff off of like the jail store. So, I mean, that's where, I got a lot of protein from that. Yeah. You would focus on whatever like protein they gave you, whether it was eggs or some of the meat and stuff they gave you for food. I mean, and then, you would cut out like the bread. I mean, they gave you a lot of bread, so you cut out the bread and a lot of the starchy stuff, which added up. And then you would just make do. And thankfully my cellmate had been in there for the last 10 years. Wow. So he kind of knew what to do as far as figuring out like what would work, regarding like a meal plan for weight loss inside jail.
That was something else I took a mental note of when you were speaking that was interesting. It sounds like the sort of tough love approach that your cellmate took with you worked for you, and it does for some. I mean, you mentioned that he said he called you fat, and then he kind of like motivated you by kind of telling you like it is and telling you, don't feel sorry for yourself, don't be a victim. That doesn't work for everyone, and so it's kind of a tough balance to walk sometimes, because I went into being a therapist thinking everybody needed compassion, everybody just needed support and empathy. And then I realized there are a lot of people like you, maybe even 50% of the people that I treat, that actually do want to have some accountability. They want structure, a little kick in the ass. They want some feedback that feels lovingly, a loving push, right? So can you speak to that in terms of how that worked for you? Do you incorporate that in the way that you work with people now as a trainer and coach, or how do you see that?
I mean, what I've learned is delivery is everything. Right? You can show somebody tough love without being like incredibly tough, right? For me, I resonated with that for some reason. It's just what I needed to hear in that moment. And do I think that's the approach? Like everybody needs to be like David Goggins? I mean, no, not necessarily. However, I think there is some like truth to like just taking, extreme ownership for your life and realizing that you have to just show up. And you have to do the hard thing. I mean, recovery is hard. There's no way around it, especially like early on. And you can't pamper yourself or coddle yourself or allow yourself to be coddled, because it will set yourself up, for failure in a way. And it's not to say you can't have compassion. There's a difference in my mind between compassion and coddling. And when I coach people now, I mean, it just all depends on who it is. If it's somebody that I know that I can just tell it like it is in a very direct way, I do it that way. If it's somebody that I know, like maybe I can get them to admit this on their own by asking the right questions, I do it that way. Because I think what you'll find is people know what to do, right? People know when their life is not going well. But it's how do you get them to open up about why it's not going well, and get them to open up about what they think they need to do and what they have the confidence to do to be able to move forward. But yeah, I mean, I'm not the person like that sugarcoat stuff necessarily. I mean, I have a way of communicating very directly with people, and if it's somebody that I'm like, probably not the right time to like go in with the straight shooter mentality, like to come in through compassion, because it's like you can be direct with somebody without being a jerk. You know, I think tough love often gets associated with be a jerk. You're being a jerk to somebody, or you're being militant or whatever, right? When really it's just like you're telling somebody what they need to hear. They don't want to admit in themselves, right?
Especially if they are in a place where everything else they've tried doesn't work. You know, they're the time for kid gloves is past, because that's what put you in this position in the first place. So maybe it's your job, Doug, to give them that kick in the ass and say, hey, all the other things you've tried haven't worked, so now it's time for some tough love, you know, with compassion.
Totally.
Yeah, I was surprised when I was studying in grad school to become a therapist. One of the concepts that they talked about was confrontation. And I heard that word, and I thought to myself, we're supposed to confront our therapist? Like, I've never had a therapist confront me. And then I realized that word, there's no inherent negative connotation to that word. But I talk about with my clients the difference between confrontation and conflict. A lot of people associate confrontation with conflict. Like you're going in and you're starting a fight with someone. Confronting someone is not necessarily negative. It's just, as you said, bringing to someone's attention something that needs to be brought to their attention. You can do that in a loving way. It can be setting a boundary. It can be communicating care and concern. It can be a lot of things, but confronting that person with that thing is not necessarily an argument or a conflict. And so, yeah, and I think everyone is different in terms of what they respond to. That could be just about their temperament, could be the way that they were raised and their style of parenting that was familiar to them. My dad was my coach growing up, and he talked about the carrot and the stick, which was something he learned from Tommy Lasorda, who was the manager of the Dodgers. It was like some guys come up from the minors, and you try to give them lots of love and support, and that you don't get the best out of them, and you realize you got to kick them in the butt or tell them, you're nothing, you're going to be back in the minors in 3 weeks if you don't shape up. And then all of a sudden they perform because they like that pressure, and they actually do their best when they're under that kind of pressure. And then other people, you try to do that to them, and you tell them, and you beat them up, and you give them a kick in the butt, and they just kind of crumble. And they just needed that sort of like fatherly love and guidance and support. You're the best. You're going to do this. You're going to achieve your dreams. You just got to stick with it. And so I think there's a challenge there of just kind of intuitively feeling out somebody's way of responding, and not just for coaches and therapists, but for the people in our lives. You know, you got to consider the person you're talking to before you start one way or the other.
Right. Totally. Yeah. I think it's an important thing that people have to remember, because, otherwise you end up like ruining relationships. I mean, I remember early in my career as a trainer, I thought that everybody should be as obsessed with fitness as I was, and then people would be like, yeah, I have like, I can't commit to like 4 days a week, Doug. I have like 4 kids, and, I have a job, and I got to run them to practice. And I'd be like, just fit it in, like figure out wherever you can fit, And then as I got older, I realized how unrealistic my expectations of my clients were. And you begin to like kind of shift, like, yeah, there are the people that are like, you know what, like I want to like look a certain way and get into a certain level of fitness. And those people, yeah, they have to like do a certain amount of thing. But the people that were just coming in just to like be generally healthy, like that was the total wrong approach.
Okay. So I want to be respectful of your time, Doug. Tell us about what you're doing now, how people can get in touch with you. You're speaking, you're coaching, you're training. Tell us about you and your business.
Yeah, I mean, the best way to like kind of get more of me is to listen to the podcast, The Adversity Advantage, which you mentioned you've been on, which was a great episode. If people want to learn more about my services, my books and stuff, they can just go to DougBopst.com. And I'm also on social media at Doug Bopst, wherever people, flock to regarding social media.
Well, Doug, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for being a guest on our show.
You got it. I loved it.
All right. Well, tune in every Tuesday for new episodes of the Harder to Breathe podcast. We want to thank our guest this week, Doug Bopst. We'll see you next time right here on the Harder to Breathe podcast.